can have like objective metrics of progress, or you can have subjective metrics of progress. So you can change your experience of flow or your degree of anxiety by creating a more refined mental model of what success looks like. So in the play research, they find that if you succeed less than 30% of the time, you lose motivation. So you can imagine that a lot of people go to Jiu Jitsu and they do not tap out their opponent 30% of the time. So Bren, it's nice to meet you. Actually, I don't believe that we've ever spoken before.
Yeah, you too. I've heard a lot of great things. So
I hear it.
Cool.
I've been anticipating this conversation. I really, I enjoy the content you've been putting out on YouTube. You've been building quite a little platform for yourself.
Thank you.
And what I think is cool is you've talked about this yourself. The sense that the movement culture is kind of a closed system. It's not open source, and there needs to be more open source.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting to me about having a conversation with you is you're someone who I think still really has a lot of movement culture kind of paradigm. Like a lot of people who leave working with Ido or sort of reject the whole thing. It seems like you're still really attuned and kind of aligned with a lot of that conceptualization.
Yeah.
But you're wanting to open the conversation up in a broader way.
Yeah. And that's cool that you can see that. And I remember you mentioned some of it in one of the comments. We'll get into all that, which will be great. But yeah, totally. So the thing is, like, I think, I mentioned this publicly, like, there's a lot of people that just completely disregard Ido, but I really think he is a genius. He is brilliant. Of course, there's like limits, right? He's not God. He's not omnipotent or, all knowing. So there's definitely a lot of mistakes. And I think, like, he's the sort of guy, like, he'll say anything with like so much conviction, like so much conviction that it's just like,
And not just with conviction, but very articulately and very charismatically. So it's easy.
Exactly.
So I'll finish my little preamble here. So I've been excited to do that with you. What I've noticed, like, I've consumed a lot of your content here, and I think it's really cool because I think we have this intersection where we both share our deep interest in the kind of motor learning research that's out there.
Yeah.
How that needs to get much more widely understood in communities of movement practice. So I think that's a really cool commonality. But I also noticed that there's some areas where we do have some good creative friction, where I think you're still in some sense in the stuff that I'm critical about the movement culture. So I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation. I think I've got so many topics here. I'm sure we're not going to get to it all. Before we really dig in, I'd love to just have you give just a quick background. You started kind of in athletics with weightlifting, and then became influenced by Ido, went into the gymnastics, and now you're practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and movement culture. Is that kind of the basics of it?
Pretty much. Yeah. I was, you're generously leaving out the part where I was very uncoordinated.
Yeah. Sure. The playing lots of, what was it, StarCraft as a kid?
Yeah.
Okay. So you played lots of StarCraft. You were doing cellular biology, basically? Cellular biology. You started in high school.
Chemistry. Yeah.
Okay. And then now, have you completed your master's in motor science or motor learning?
There is no motor learning degree where I'm studying, unfortunately. Okay. I was pressing God, I would love to have done that. But I'm almost done with a master's just in kinesiology in general.
Okay, cool. Very cool. So that's kind of your background. You have outside the movement cult and you're doing this stuff. So hopefully that's enough background and we can get into the meat of it.
I would also say, I think at least I feel like I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things we can discuss today, but I certainly feel that I've been branching off from a lot of the movement culture, like ideas and like the kind of dogmatism. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say like I'm in movement culture anymore.
Yeah. Movement culture adjacent.
Yeah. Movement culture adjacent, like whatever.
Describe yourself as a movement teacher, correct?
Definitely. Yeah.
And that's the kind of primary work you're doing aside from your
100%.
role as a student.
Yeah.
So I'm writing an article right now called basically an article about what does it mean to be a movement generalist.
Ooh.
And I'm on my fourth attempt at it, and I keep skidding.
Yeah.
In various ways because there's a lot of things I want to say. And one thing that's interesting to me is like looking back at the history of it. So I started training parkour in 2005, and then I started doing becoming aware of CrossFit about 6 months into that.
Yeah.
And I look back on this, and I think that in the kind of broader sphere of physical culture, there's a movement towards functional fitness, towards kind of more athletic approaches to fitness, moving away from the isolation that's happening all through the 90s. And it's really catalyzed and gains mainstream traction with CrossFit. And if you go back to the original CrossFit documents, they talk about fitness as not being just how long you can run or your VO2 max, but as being the balance of athletic attributes, speed, power, strength, agility, balance, etc. Right? The three metabolic systems: phosphagen, glycolytic, and aerobic. And then they have this idea of the athlete who performs best across any number of potential movement tasks, right? So they call that the infinite hopper model. So the infinite hopper model is, you imagine a hopper that puts out movement tasks.
Yeah.
Performs the best at that.
Yeah.
Athlete. What's interesting about CrossFit is in the early days, and Ido, I know, was into CrossFit in the early days as well, right?
Yeah.
So both kind of this community of influenced by CrossFit. In that early CrossFit, they were doing tumbling, right? They were doing press to handstands. They were doing, front flips and back flips and splits. And they were saying, learn new sports all the time. Yeah. That's part of the original CrossFit model. And then it gets simplified and turns into work capacity across broad time and mobile domains. So what's interesting to me is I think that Ido can really be understood as like taking that CrossFit model and recognizing that the infinite hopper aspect is actually the top, right? That the athletic attributes and the energy systems are actually subsidiary to the general ability to complete movement tasks.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Mostly. I wonder, one of the things I think about that's just been coming up more recently is there's so much focus on quality in the movement culture.
Yeah.
Or let's say Ido's movement culture to make things a little more simple. Yeah. That when you're so focused on that quality, it limits how many things you can do. Right? So like, say I show you a Hole, right? Like if you have to perfect that move, and if you teach students so that they cannot move on or learn another move until they perfect that move, you really limit how much you show them. And to me, that feels a little different than this infinite hopper model that you've described. I
think that's an error. See, I think that's an error in programming rather than a difference in conceptualization. I think what Ido says is about.
I don't know. I think it has to do with the conceptualization of quality, of like this necessity. Yeah. So I'll give you an example.
Quality, the necessity of quality to me doesn't change the fact that the overarching described goal is this general capacity for movement.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Within, I think there's feedback coming from that. So I think that there's a general overarching thing, right? And I think that's the same. I think that's the way Ido would describe it, or he never likes, to agree with people.
Yeah.
But I think that's sort of what he's thinking. But because it's not just so the example that comes to mind is like dancers, right? So like dancers versus like a lot of, let's say, movement students, with the way they train dance, like there's so many moves over and over, new move, new move, new move, new move. You take a dance class, if you're a beginner, there's like, I don't know, 20 new moves. If you're advanced, there's like, maybe you've seen a lot of them before, but maybe there's 100, 150, like plus, right? And each of those have a lot, tons and tons of details within them. And so for me, I think about like it kind of being a fundamental difference. Like when I think about like the way you describe this infinite hopper model, maybe it's just terminology, and what you're saying is programming. I'm thinking of a little differently, but to me, like when I think of this infinite hopper model, I think of like if we really were to just throw everything at people, right? Throw tons of random movement tasks at people from all these different disciplines. And we see like how well you can perform in these different areas, in these different movements, in these different tasks. Like I think of like this dancer approach where they're exposed to so many new movements all the time with such a little fixation on the quality for any of them. They're trying to do them well, but there's not this need to perfect any move before you learn another one. Like it's just accepted that you're doing your best and it's it's not even close to perfect, and we're doing the next one already, right? But with dancers, like what I think you find is the quality of the movements they perform, if you were to rapid fire throw them these sort of hopper tasks, is really, really high. It's actually, I would say, higher than like the way movement students are being taught right now, where they've got a set of moves that they can do really, really well.
Yeah.
Do you see that? Like what I'm trying to say? Like,
no, I agree completely. I think it's just orthogonal to the point that I'm making.
Sure.
I think that what you're describing is, if the goal is this universal competence, you actually need to do more exploration and allow the process to be dirtier. And if you get there by doing exactly perfect movements, then you're kind of missing the point.
Yeah.
So I think that'll be a useful thing to dive into more as we go forward.
Yeah.
The motor learning aspect here. But to go back to this idea of, I was thinking about the kind of evolution of this and how all of this is kind of like presaged already in the past. Like if you go back to, George Hebert, Margaret Stryker, Bernard McFadden, like physical culture was very movement oriented in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. And it became very isolated. And there's this kind of reclamation of functionality in the 90s. And then there was CrossFit. And then there was the idea of, wait, actually, we really want to be competent in movement. And that was happening like, I think Julie Angel is actually the person who came up with the term movement culture. At least that's what she tells me.
Okay.
But like Ido and myself and Simon Sacker and Josef Frusek and various other people, Katie Bowman, we were all talking about movement. And then Ido's star went really big. And then he kind of was like, no, nobody else gets to talk about movement. But there was a movement culture that was a little bit broader than people really remember.
Right.
And I, so I was part of that, but Ido did kind of catalyze in me a movement from thinking about things as fitness first and to thinking about things as movement first.
Right.
But when I read the original CrossFit documents, they made a huge impact on me.
Yeah.
But there was this. So what CrossFit comes up with then is the optimal movers, the fittest person is a combination of a gymnast, because gymnasts learn new sports faster than other people, a weightlifter, and a middle distance runner. And that's going to be the best across all of these sort of sets of attributes that they're talking about. And I was already doing parkour, and I was like, parkour is definitely a better base than gymnastics.
Yeah.
And where's martial arts in here, right?
Yeah. And
so I started thinking about this idea of relevance, right? If you have to do a CrossFit workout, you have to, whether you're successful or not, you're fine, right? But if you have to fight off a mugger or escape a burning building,
right,
it's pass fail, right? It's more relevant. It's also more like relevant evolutionarily. So I was like, that idea of an archetype is interesting, but I think we can do better than that.
Yeah.
And then with Ido, I really see a similar kind of development or with the movement culture, there's a similar sort of combination of things. It starts with floreo from capoeira, hand balancing, and gymnastics strength. Those are really the core elements in the beginning, as far as I can tell. And then over time, aspects of modern dance and contemporary dance and Russian martial arts, and then now recently, like internal Chinese martial arts, have all sort of been brought into what movement culture is. But there is a very specific set of skills that are kind of derived from specific disciplines that have been what you see people who claim the term movement primarily practicing. There's not a huge diversity in people who are talking about movement within that frame in the primary disciplines that they're pulling from.
Yes.
And again, I think the ideas there's some really good ideas there, but I think that there's a lack of relevance to the fundamental skills that the method is based off of. And so Ido's response to this seems to have been to say, there's no hierarchy in movement.
Yeah.
Which I think honestly, I think it's a little bit of bullshit, because if there's no hierarchy in movement, then you don't have a reason to focus on the things that you do. And I've seen you talk about this as well.
Yeah.
You're like, no. I'm getting rid of the rhizomatic thing.
Yeah.
I prioritize dance and grappling.
Yeah.
So this is, I think, a really interesting intersection between the way that I've been thinking and the way that you've been thinking.
Yeah.
There has to be hierarchy, I think, within movement. It's not enough to train for everything. You actually have to train for the most relevant things.
Yeah.
So that was kind of just where I wanted to start the conversation. Was like, here's the history of it. Now we kind of have two main questions that have to do with, like, how do you do movement well? Which is, what are actually the things that you prioritize? And two, how do we go about learning it? And I think the aspect of how we go about learning it is the area where we have a lot of commonality already.
Right.
The aspect of what the prioritization is kind of the interesting, the interesting potential, difference of viewpoint.
So how would you prioritize these things?
I don't know. I put it out there, but I would say that parkour, basically the way that I look at it, there's locomotion, there's manipulation of objects.
All right. How would you define define locomotion?
Locomotion is moving our body through space, right?
Okay.
So then manipulation is moving the objects around us. So you can think about the environment as elements that are fixed and elements that are mobile. So when we are moving ourselves through the fixed environment, that's locomotion. When we're moving objects when we're relatively fixed and we're moving the objects around us, that's manipulation. And then interaction is when we're moving with something else that has the capacity to move. And that can be either cooperative or combative.
Okay.
So those are the four layers. And then my critique of most of what's happening, not just with Ido's movement culture, but like GMB or Animal Flow or any of these things, is I like these guys. I think there's great stuff there.
Yeah.
Human locomotion didn't evolve to be done on flat ground, right? It evolved to be able to solve environments. And that's why I think that parkour fundamentally is the base. And the locomotive patterns that we see in movement culture are derived from floreo and modern dance. And I think that's actually, I think it's a path dependent thing that happened that's actually misleading. Sorry, I'm just throwing.
No. You want to expand on that?
Yeah. So basically, Ido starts with capoeira, right? And then he gets interested in strength and conditioning.
Okay.
So then he starts thinking about movement. What movement does he focus on? He focuses on patterns of movement that are mostly derived originally from capoeira.
Okay.
He's adopting a wider perspective on movement, but that wider perspective on movement is derived from his experience with capoeira that he's already really good at.
Right.
So I trained with Ido in 2012, right? And I was doing parkour. And he saw me jumping between bars at height and was like, I would never try this. I would never do this.
Right.
I was like, well, why not? Right.
Yeah.
Where's the generalist mover here? What is it that we're really trying to get at with movement?
Hmm.
And then he went and trained with the Parkour Generations guys with Stefan Vigro, who I know. And he came back and he just brought the rail back. that was it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So I think that movement culture in some sense fell into a trap in the beginning because it was derived from a very abstracted part of a discipline. For me, capoeira is actually more complete as a movement culture because it involves the interaction.
Yeah.
Which is much more alive.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is something I've talked about with my friend Grant, that it's like this extraction process that kind of goes on. Like, it is an extraction process, right? Like, it's in a way, it's the same thing we do with food, right? We're like, oh, like, what's the most valuable part of this corn?
Yeah.
It's the fructose, right? So let's just like get a whole ton of it. Let's like do this whole process. Let's get all the fructose, and we'll put it in everything, and and we've got our thing. And the problem with that is manifold, but you've in a way you've bastardized the original thing by taking out this individual part of it. And I think these examples you're bringing are great examples of that, as many others, right? Like capoeira in particular, when you pull out the element of the partner, capoeira is entirely like it's in a way, it's more about the relationship with the partner than the actual moves that you do, right? And so, and the relationship with the partner, and also like the wider social interaction.
Mm-hmm. And the history too. Like capoeira is the music, capoeira is the folklore,
the culture, exactly. And so when you take that out and you just focus on the moves, and moves are nice, but there's a lot you lose when you extract the isolated section. The rail work with parkour, another great example, and same thing with like boxing, where like the extraction has been this like focus on like the touch game of like you're doing footwork and you're trying to touch the other person's shoulders, but there's something you lose when you never get punched in the face, right? Like when you
yeah. I'm gonna be, I guess, very critical here, but I think you lose the most important things of almost all those disciplines when you do it like this. So it's interesting because I guess I'll go in a couple of different ways. One, that idea of the extraction thing is really interesting because that's an idea that I've been thinking about for a long time as well. So I was sitting down with a friend of mine, Stefan Guillenet, who's a neurobiology PhD from the University of Washington. He studies obesity.
Nice.
And what he told me was that what the food industry has done was they've divorced flavor from nutrition.
Right.
Create hyper products that stimulate us to eat beyond healthy for us, because the sweetness is no longer necessarily attached to the fiber and water that's in fruit.
Right.
And it had this chain of insights for me that like pornography is sexuality extracted from relationships. Video games are thrill extracted from physicality. Like you can social media is social approval extracted from actual relationships.
Right. Yep.
So over and over again, it looks like a hack on capitalism is how to create a hyper stimulating version of something that then we can. I actually don't think that like junk food is designed to be unhealthy. I think that's it's not that. What junk food is designed to be is what is the thing that will kind of stimulate your pleasure centers the most, that is the cheapest to deliver.
Exactly.
So to be cheap, it needs to be able to be made from really, cheap things and be very shelf stable, right? You buy an apple, it rots a week later. You buy a Twinkie, you can eat it 30 weeks later, right?
Right.
Like you think about like if you're a company trying to make money, how much like decreasing those costs, right? Like how much spoilage are you worried about if you're a candy company?
Right. Right.
So that's kind of, I'm getting a little bit off tangent here.
Oh, no.
Really cool that you identified the same thing, but I hadn't exactly contextualized what I see happening in movement culture the same way. The way that I've been thinking about it is that there's an incentive problem in movement culture, because movement culture basically spreads via social media.
Okay. Yes.
Right. So social media is about.
Well, let's say there's two parts of it, right? There's the social media side, and then there's also the in-person side and
There is. I think, I try to make a distinction between like Ido and his core students and like movement culture as it plays out on everyone who's trying to play the game on social media.
Right.
Right. I have critiques of Ido and his core students, but I have a bigger critique, or I'm much more critical of that social.
Right.
Media.
Right.
I think that what you're pointing out has to do with this social aspect, which is when you are a generalist, you're going to suck relatively at all the specialist activities.
Right.
So to gain attention, putting out like a shitty sparring video and a shitty parkour video,
right,
dance video,
right,
but you can go to a boxing class and notice that 1% of the time they play with tennis balls, and you can just go spend 5 hours a day playing with tennis balls for 3 weeks, and then you can be as good as Lomachenko at punching tennis balls, because Lomachenko knows that tennis balls don't actually have that much impact on his performance.
Right.
He's not going to spend that much time on it. He spends
right.
much time on pad work and sparring and heavy bag work.
Right.
So what I call this is the problem of fishing from the shallow end of the Pareto distribution.
So which side are you calling the shallow end? Like the
shallow end. The shallow end is where you're getting you're putting 80% of the effort out to get 20% of the benefit, or 90% of the effort to get 1% of the benefit.
Okay. Yeah.
So if your approach to how you're going to extract value from boxing is to practice combinations and punch tennis balls, but to never spar, to never do heavy bag work, to never do a live pad work, right? You can do as much effort as a boxer, and you can look really great on social media practicing these patterns, and you have zero ability to fight.
So I'll have a funny tangent for you on this. So when I first started doing Jiu Jitsu, this was actually right before movement camp in 2016. So there's going to be Jiu Jitsu at movement camp. I was like, okay, I'll start early and get a jump on everyone. Anyway, so I started doing Jiu Jitsu.
Hey, so now we need to take a moment for a word from our sponsor, which is ourselves, Evolve Move Play. You may not know this, but Evolve Move Play has an amazing online course system designed to help you take on the ideas that we share in this podcast as an actual physical practice. So we built in-depth instructional guides to help you build a complete natural movement practice, including how to safely build your skills up, how to identify areas where you can train, whether in a beautiful natural space like this, a gym, a playground, or an urban area near you, whatever you need to make it work for you. We designed a way to incorporate it into an overall natural movement lifestyle to help rejuvenate your body and mind, and how to integrate mindfulness so that you can gain the most from your movement practice and translate it into your life. When you join any of our programs, you'll also get access to our exclusive members area. This is an online forum separated from all the big social media sites, where you're going to have dedicated conversations around movement, mindfulness, nature connection, community, the core themes that we explore on the Evolve Move Play podcast. There's a growing community from all over the world who are now putting the Evolve Move Play practices into their lives. We want you to join us in experiencing how powerful that can be and how powerful a space devoted to these practices can be. So if you've been loving the ideas that we share on the Evolve Move Play podcast, I think you owe it to yourself to take the next step and experience what Evolve Move Play can offer as a teaching platform. There's so many great resources for you, and we've got a variety of programs available that you can get started with that meet your level. Or if you really want to save some money, you can grab one of our bundles that covers a variety of our programs. If you love the ideas that are shared on the Evolve Move Play Movement podcast, and you want to take them from just being ideas to actually being practices that you're using in your life, then you can start today by joining us for one of our online courses. Or you can save big by grabbing a bundle of many of our courses together. You can find those at the link in the description or by clicking here.
And one of the things I noticed, like, very quickly was like that it's extremely hard to do. You have some experience with grappling as well, yeah?
Yeah, I've been in and out of jiu-jitsu since I was 15.
Nice. So I noticed very quickly, like there's a lot of the moves that I would drill and I just like couldn't really do it on other people. Yep. People would drill and they couldn't do it on me. And it was just like this enormous gap between like the way you would drill and then like what would happen in sparring. And so my first response to this was like, okay, I'm going to skip the drilling. I'm just going to do the sparring. Mm-hmm. And in a way it was a success. Like there were a lot of the people I started with, like in their same sort of cohort, that would like, they would focus on the drilling. They get really good at the drilling, and you give them an unresisted opponent, they do the move, it looks great. You know, it's super sharp. You give me the unresisted opponent, like, I'm like, it's hard to do. But as soon as we start sparring, the whole the game is completely different, you know, completely different. And I made more progress than a lot of those people. Granted, like, there's better ways to do it. But
so again, this is the problem of the generalist, and how do you fish from the deep end of the Pareto distribution?
Yeah.
Only one thing from martial arts.
Yeah.
Spar. That's actually what you should do.
I agree.
Because it's where most of the benefit is. So I started, like I said, I started training jiu-jitsu and kickboxing when I was 15 years old. So I trained for about a year and a half, then my school shut down. And then I kind of like just did some backyard sparring with friends until I was 19. Yeah. And then I found some like a jiu-jitsu club at school, etc. I didn't get into a real school until I was 23, I guess, 24.
Yeah.
And then I was training in the first MMA school here. It was a straight blast gym. So it was
nice.
Affiliates. And so I had really good coaching, and I was training for, I think, 2.5 years there. I did about a year and a half of jiu-jitsu, and then I only did Muay Thai after that because parkour and jiu-jitsu were not going well together for me. My elbows were constantly fucked.
Oh, interesting.
So then...
Sorry, what part of parkour is demanding on the elbows?
All the climbing.
Oh, okay, cool.
Climb ups, and then doing arm bars, getting arm barred every day. I used to do the thing, which I think is a really dumb thing in jiu-jitsu, which is like 25 arm bars at the beginning of every class.
Yeah.
You know, just dead patterns, but then you have all these spastic people who are over pulling the arm bar, and then you just have people with chronic elbow tendonitis.
Okay.
So anyway, so then I moved to Seattle to start Parkour Visions, the parkour gym down here. And I didn't train in a gym for 9 years, except for like a couple times when I was out on a seminar or something.
Yeah.
And I came back to jiu-jitsu, but what I did was I had students who are my movement students, and I sparred them. It was like, if we're gonna train martial arts, we're gonna spar.
Right.
So I sparred probably, once a week for many years in those 9 years. And I went back to the jiu-jitsu gym, and I tapped blue belts and purple belts, right away. Right. Big, super athletic from doing parkour, just throw people around. And I still have the instincts. I still have the awareness of how to move my body with another person.
Right.
So yeah, I was listening to Firas Zahabi, and he was talking about how pad work, right? Like up until basically, it wasn't until the 1990s that striking coaches in the United States, at least, were doing a lot of like focus mat work.
Oh, interesting.
So if you go back and you look at, Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, Thomas Hearns, Muhammad Ali, all these guys, all they did was spar and heavy bag work and road work.
Oh, interesting.
They ran, they sparred, and they hit the heavy bag. And you're saying that's all you need, right?
Yeah.
Pad work is nice, but it's not necessary.
Yeah.
I think as a generalist, that's the key problem that generalist faces is select the most relevant disciplines to be focused on, and then select the best aspects of them, right? So do the sparring. Don't do the straight pattern work, right? If you're going to do parkour, like play chase tag.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't just mess around on rails. If you're going to do, if you're going to do dance, man, just practice patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of at the heart of my philosophy, and the philosophy of kind of aliveness as it applies to movement practice.
Yeah. That's sort of where I've been at for a few years. And now I'm starting to even rethink that a little. I guess it depends on the context, I suppose. So I think one of the things, because like with Jiu Jitsu, for instance, like I'll give you the example of like how I would teach a new student Jiu Jitsu. Like, there would be a good chunk of sparring, but I would also find a way to because at the end of the day, like I think we're kind of talking about changing perception action coupling.
Yep.
Right? We want to change. If you encounter a certain situation, you perceive a certain situation, we want to change your reaction to it and replace it with something that is a better reaction, right? Better, quicker, more accurate, more effective. One of the things, like if you see with all the stuff with AI, right? Like it's the same sort of idea, artificial intelligence. They run the same sort of things we do. They're modeled after how the brain works. Mm-hmm. And what's really cool with AI is you can just run cycles of refinement, right? There's all this complicated math of gradient descent and how you're going to essentially try to optimize. There's all these different algorithms of how you do things. But imagine so you have a model, and then say there's 100 instances of that you make slight variations in each. Okay, bring it back. So there's a program this YouTuber made where you could basically try to teach these shapes to walk.
Yeah.
So you make this geometric shape, and then it would make you could change what the population is. Say the population is 100, and for each generation, you have 100 population of 100 objects with each slight variations. They each try to walk a certain distance. One of them or a few of them are going to get the farthest, and you take those, and then you make those the base for the next generation. You make small changes to each of those, and then you run it over and over. You do generation. And it's, with a computer, you can just do hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, right? And you just run this over and over and over and over. And in a way, this is sort of what sparring is, right? Exactly. This is what the brain is really doing a much better version of that when we actually just spar. But one of the things that happens fairly quickly is you just run into the same pattern, right? So you get the shape that works fairly well, and that's it. All the variation, it's somewhat optimized, and so any of the variations generally make it worse. So it sticks with that same pattern. Yeah.
So that's a local optimum, right? So you're stuck on a local optimum. Yes. It's not a global optimum. And the other thing that you're describing that is the idea of an extinction function or operant processing. So this is huge for me in how we conceptualize, opponent processing. This is huge for how we conceptualize what makes good movement, right? Mm. So you need something that tells you whether the patterns that you are trying are actually effective. So that's the idea of opponent processing. This is in Ido's interview on London Real. He said, "What kind of muscles you have, bro? No, what kind of patterns?" And I was like, no, I don't give a shit about what kind of patterns you have. What kind of solutions do you have? Right?
Okay.
What makes a great mover is the ability to solve movement problems. How do you know that you're good at solving movement problems? You're regularly exposed to different kinds of movement problems. But as you said, if you're exposed in a kind of the same way over and over again, even if it's something as diverse as sparring, you can end up at these local optima. That's exactly what happened to me when I started Jiu Jitsu again. So I came back to Jiu Jitsu after 9 years, and I had a really good kind of instinctive understanding of where I was threatened and how to kind of be reactive and defensive. But I had a very rudimentary offensive game. So what would happen is that I'm 6'2", 220 pounds. Most people who spar with me, they just will automatically pull guard. They don't want to try to fight me for the takedown. So they'll pull guard. So I'm used to people pulling guard, and I'm gonna break their guard. Like 90% of the time, I'm gonna shift my hips back, put my elbows in their things, knee slice through. And then once I attain top position, I'll threaten collar choke, which I actually never, ever hit.
Okay.
But based on the threat of the collar choke, I'll get them to give up back control or an armbar. And this worked for me against everyone in the gym except the most like physically powerful brown belts. The first like 5 weeks I was there. But then all the purple belts like realized this is what I was going to do. And it stopped working. And I didn't have another option, right? But if I kept sparring like white belts, I would never stop doing that because it's local optimum, right? So you need the right kinds of exposure and variability to break yourself out of those local optimums and be able to see kind of these next things. And that's where play is actually so powerful, because play essentially gets you to do that. And that was what a lot of my jiu-jitsu coaches told me, is like, okay, you can win. Now expose yourself. Now play with all the other positions. Like, go north-south, right? Make it really easy for them to roll you so you can spend some time. Like I started pulling guard all the time because I was like, I'm never going to learn to get submissions from guard unless I spend time in guard. So that's kind of my reaction to what you were saying.
I think of it twofold as well. Like there's one thing of like, how do you assess how well you did? Right? And in grappling, it's fairly straightforward generally, right? Because it's like you get points, or like you get the submission, or you get submitted. But like something like dance, right? Then that problem gets a hell of a. If you don't have a teacher, like how do you don't have a teacher, say you've just made up a new move, like how do you know what's good or not? How do you, like that becomes a much harder problem. But I also think of like I think of it as two separate things of like, how do I assess what I did, how good that is? And then also like, how do I find something better? Like I think of those differently actually. And I think in one of my friends who's in AI basically told me that they do similar things with how they model. Like there's two separate models, one for like assessing the errors and one more for like kind of finding a better solution. Like it's the specifics are, I'm a little rusty.
It's called the explore paradox. Are you familiar with that?
Vaguely. Do you want to explain it?
Yeah. So the idea is that essentially, imagine that you're moving through a network, right? Or through a landscape, and there are resources in the landscape. And there's a cost for the extraction of the resource.
Right.
So the longer that you extract the resource, the higher cost you think. But then there's a variable cost to explore and find a new access.
Right.
So you run this trade-off of like, do I keep staying in this? Do I keep threatening the collar choke and trying to go for the armbar? Or do I like try to threaten the armbar and find something off of it?
Right.
So that's the explore aspect.
And is it worth it to do so when the armbar works 99% of the time?
Yeah. And so so one thing that happens there is like you could say, okay, I tried for my collar cross collar choke into my armbar sequence, this triple threat that I have, and it didn't work today. Why didn't it work? Well, I needed to keep my pressure more here or whatever, or, I let him strip my grip when I shouldn't have. Or you could say, what's another thing that I can do, right? This system, I've gone as far as I can with this system.
Yeah.
How do I install a new system? How do I go find a new system? What's a new system that could work?
Right.
And that's what I think you see really great jiu-jitsu guys do. Like if you look at John Danaher and what he's doing with Gordon Ryan, it's like you can see how like Gordon or Gary Tonin or any of these guys, like they go to competitions and they hit the same thing over and over and over again. And then they come back a year later and they're hitting a totally different system. Yeah. It's like, they're like, I'm doing back attacks. That's what I'm going to specialize in. Then I'm doing leg attacks, and that's what I'm going to specialize in. And so there's that way of kind of optimizing through both exploitation and exploration.
Yeah.
I think those are really useful concepts for how we apply ourselves to the problem of being a movement generalist. In the same sense, it's like, I think I came up with this concept years ago of like a generalist should have a widening and deepening and kind of be moving in between them. So widening a practice would be like, if you practice parkour and MMA and basketball, you could, go practice dance, right? So you're widening your scope. And deepening would be like, this aspect of parkour, I'm going to get really good at this. I'm going to go do bar stuff really, really well.
Yeah.
And I think that we kind of need to adjust those dials repeatedly. So we'll go wider, then we'll go narrower, wider, narrow, wider, narrow, over and over again. And I think that kind of fits this exploit and explore concept as well.
Like there's a exploit explore as far as like optimizing for like a single solution, right? So like I think you have way more parkour experience than I do, but if I were to say like, if parkour was, here's this environment, you're trying to get from A to B as quickly as possible through that environment, right? Then I think, and say you've already done it a bunch of times. I think that's where I could see something like this exploit explore paradox being really strong, right? Okay, you've got your path. Do you try to, and you've got your path and you have the goal of getting there faster, right? Your goal is like a simple quantifiable result. And the question becomes, do you try to like adjust how you go over that log to like, like maybe jump a little lower so you like don't waste quite so much time there? Or do you try like a totally different route, right? Like that's where I see that paradox being really there, and more challenging of a problem. I think for movement development overall, I think it's much more easy, right? Like I think, like if we think of like, if we were to think of that like Pareto law or diminishing returns on any kind of like movement or skill or position or situation, then you're going to get more returns on like the first exploration of that thing. And hence, it would kind of always make sense, or at least from that perspective, it would always make sense to explore the new thing. Like if you've got your, like, even if you're, forget if you're arm barring people, like if you've got your route that you've already gone to of, okay, they pull guard and then I pass the guard, even if you aren't good enough to armbar someone yet, right? So that paradox is a little harder. you're going to get more development from pulling guard because you've never done it before. Right?
Yeah. So I guess on one level, I agree. I think that there's this kind of novice gains that are available.
Yes.
But but if we go back to the beginning of the conversation, this idea of there's a hierarchy of movement. There's things that are actually
right. Yes.
Right. So now all of a sudden you have an impetus to stay on the things that are most important to exploit. Mm-hmm. Right. So you could say, okay, if you want to develop the most sort of general movement competency, maybe you want to try everything that you possibly can in jiu-jitsu. But if you want to be great at jiu-jitsu, there's actually certain things that are keystones in the movement. And you want to spend more of your time on those. And I think it's the same thing. It's like I think fundamentally parkour is more important than polka. Right? Right. So you do want to do that, and I also think there's this interesting aspect of I've noticed this paradox, or this sort of there actually tends to be a personality that's associated with being a kind of I would call this like a novice generalist. Yeah. And then there's a personality that's associated with being like a really stuck specialist. Right. And what I've noticed is that people who naturally pick up skills quickly or are broadly athletic will often just kind of practice a lot of different things, but not necessarily to a high level. Right. People who struggle will often end up in one very specific thing. And the reason I think that for this is that there's a psychological cost to reaching the point at which something is a struggle. And then do you continue doing it? So for someone who the beginning phases are easy, there's no struggle to adopting a new sport. But there's a point at which in your development of any athletic discipline, you're going to struggle, right? So you could say, like, I'm doing some parkour. I'm doing really good at parkour. It's great. And now I've taken a few falls. This next set of skills is just not coming. Right. And my buddies are now snowboarding. It's snowboarding season. Like, I go to snowboarding and I'm better than all my buddies at snowboarding. All right. The end of the season, it's getting hard. It's like all my friends are going surfing. We're off to surf. So I've met a lot of these guys who are just like kind of good at everything, but they're not really great at anything. Mm. And to me, there's a certain shallowness to their perspective because they've never engaged deeply. Right. Then on the flip side, I meet these guys who like have been doing Aikido for 30 years and they feel super competent, and then they will not even accept the idea that anything else would be of value because they can't psychologically handle the idea of going back and sucking at something. Yeah. Because they've gotten used to being the master at one thing. Right. So I think so for me, there's lessons you learn from continually putting yourself in the novice position. And there's lessons that are only available when you pursue mastery within a specific discipline. So I actually advocate for being a generalist with a specialty. Totally. Yeah. And I would agree. And that's why I kind of prefaced what I was saying of like, if you take that perspective, because I think that's the exception to it. Like, there are things that you learn. Like, this is one of the things, like for me, like the one arm handstand is like an extremely specialist skill. Yeah. And yet, like, I find it of great value for movers because, like, I think there's something that you can only get from that magnitude of, like, if you call it a single skill, like a one arm handstand is a single skill, like something that's going to take, like, realistically, like 4 or 5 years of like serious, you know? Like, I've had this conversation with like lots of my friends, like Yuri Marmerstein and Aaron Cantor is one of our coaches who's I did a one arm handstand and all these guys. Yeah. And I'm always like, oh my God, this is just ridiculous. Cost benefit ratio. Like, Yuri told me that I think it took him 3 years and he practiced 2 hours a day for 6 days a week. Yeah. And I was like, you could have gone from like a V1 to a V5 in rock climbing, or V6. You could have like got your purple belt in jiu-jitsu. Right. Could have, like, reached like high intermediate level advanced level in parkour in that time.
Yeah.
You could have probably done like 2 of them.
That's generous, but yeah.
Right, like it's just like, to me,
the cost benefit is
so low. Like, I get it. Like, if that's the thing that you want to pursue to mastery, like the pursuit of mastery is gonna be valuable to you no matter kind of where you pursue it. But what I would look for is, I think you want to master a skill that has many close transfers.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this. I was writing, kind of like sketching this out. Like, why is parkour so important? Why is martial arts so important? I was thinking about, I think gymnastics is actually a really beautiful way to conceptualize this.
Yeah.
Think about the core skills of men's gymnastics, right? The apparatus. You've got the floor, the uneven bar, or the parallel bars, the high bar, the rings, and the pommel horse.
Mm-hmm.
These are not equal in their ability to help each other, right?
Right.
Tumbling donates to every other element. Sorry, in the vault. Tumbling donates to every other element, or the floor does. But pommel horse has very little positive transfer to anything other than a few floor exercises.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're going to be a all-around gymnast, should you build the base of your skill set on floor or on pommel horse? If you're going to predict who's going to be the best all-around gymnast, is going to be the best tumbler on the team or the best pommel specialist on the team?
It's an interesting way to put it, though, because I think in gymnastics, from my understanding, I don't think anyone really like weights it like that. Like, there's either kind of
they do, actually. So I used to be a gymnastics coach.
Yeah.
All the gymnastics coaches would tell you that tumbling is the foundation of gymnastics. They spend more time practicing tumbling than any other apparatus.
I guess so. That is, well, maybe at a basic level, but I think about, like, when I think about like the higher level guys, it feels to me like they're spending a pretty even, like, they're either like specialists, like, you know, of course there's all the ring specialists, right? That are just incredible on the rings. But like with that argument, right, it would kind of make sense to ignore pommel, and you don't really see that. Like, I don't really see that. Like, everyone hates it. Like,
I'm gonna disagree. I think that, like, if you look at the way teams are constructed now,
yeah,
like, a lot of the athletes just don't do pommel. Right?
Really?
You only need, like, you have two or three athletes, I think, who come up and score, right? And so you'll select, you have a few all-arounders who can do pommel and a specialist. And then you'll often have, like, a lot of gymnasts now only compete for apparatus. And usually the really successful ones are going to compete like floor, vault, rings, high bar, floor, vault, rings, uneven bars, or parallel bars. I'm not 100% sure. I haven't been paying attention to gymnastics anymore. But I think what has been happening, if my understanding is correct, what has been happening in gymnastics is that you've seen elite gymnasts, fewer of them are actually pursuing being all-around gymnasts. And if you're like close to an all-arounder but can't quite make it as an all-arounder, I think the most likely skill that you drop is pommel.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, maybe this has happened since I haven't been paying attention to gymnastics much the last few years.
I haven't been paying that much attention to it like 10 years ago. But yeah, that was my understanding. So so this comes to that this is the hierarchy aspect of it, right? And so I've been giving you a lot of my ideas, but I'm curious. You've talked about specifically dance and grappling should be prioritized in a movement practice. Can you give me a little bit of your thinking around why those two, or has that changed?
So actually, even with that, kind of circling back to what we were talking about with, like, the people that just kind of dabble in everything versus the people that, like, they don't touch anything other than Aikido, you know, like, I mean, one thing that's interesting, like, just from a practical perspective, is, like, sometimes you get specialists that are so good they just reach such a high level, and like they're specialists at a high level, they're professionals, so they're training, 8 hours a day. So there's just such a magnitude of difference between those professionals and kind of amateurs or hobbyists, recreational trained people, that some of those people are just incredible general movers out of like the transfer they have from that enormous skill and attributes. There's like a few athletes that come to mind. Kautera, Jason Gatson, do you know him?
I'm not familiar with either of those. Who's Kautera?
Yeah, Kautera's he's a Jiu Jitsu guy, like 12-time world champion, something like that. It's one of the lighter weights. He trains. He has an academy here in San Jose that I trained at for a number of years. But he is generally like quite athletic for someone that like really doesn't do. For someone that doesn't really dabble in many other things, like seems extremely athletic. And then Jason Gatson, also gymnast. He was one of those like sort of like tragic stories of like he was like going to be so good at coming up like junior world championships. He was like I think for a time he was one of the best gymnasts he was the best gymnast in the US, for the male gymnasts at least, and one of the best in the world, and just had a number of like crippling ACL injuries that were just like no. But so I I did a gymnastics camp like years back because I saw he was teaching and some other Olympian, and so I was like, okay, this is cool. Like I'll sign up. I get to like do gymnastics all day, and it was like the ages. It was like 8 and up. And so I messaged the organizers. I was like, is there a limit for the age? I was like, no. So I showed up and there's like all these 8, 9, 10-year-olds. There's me, and then there's like Jason Gatson. So we got to like hang out and chat a lot. And I was just like, it was just interesting. It was really fascinating for me because he was at that point, I think, retired for 8, 10 years, something like that. He had like 14 surgeries before he retired. And so I was really curious, like, okay, here's this like real specialist in a arguably a very transferable field. Yeah. How is he holding up? And my God, he was incredible. Like he was just screwing around with various things like you would not believe. And it's not like I, went over and tried to like wrestle him and like, assess his wrestling ability, but like I've definitely seen a lot of that as far as like I think the people that I've seen that are really the best overall like have just tended to be kind of professionals in one field that also dabble in others. Or like the other thing that comes to mind is like dancers, like, and this is why like I believe dance is one of the highest, if not the highest discipline I would place on this hierarchy of fields of movement. Is like there's this kind of, I call it like an axis of movement or an axis of movement development. Of motor digestion. Yeah. So it's this idea, like Ido calls it chewing, of like you see a new move, how quickly can you see, understand, digest it, and then replicate it in your body, right? And because dancers do this like all day, they get so incredibly good at it that they can see a new move, something they've never really seen before, and they can replicate it in seconds better than people could do, like an untrained person could do with like a year of practice. And like
so I know exactly what you're talking about. I started So I got interested in dance because of a television show. So You Think You Can Dance?
Oh
I
yeah.
was interested in movement. I saw that show.
Right.
I was like, oh my God, like all these patterns, all this stuff that's happening
Right.
in this dance. It's amazing. And they have
Hmm.
such, God, what's the term? Facility with movement. And you'd see the stuff that like people were going off on in movement culture just pop up in somebody's dance and then be connected to this incredibly fluid, beautiful flow in relationship to expressing emotion. It's like it's incredible. So I had a student at my parkour gym who was interested in dance too. I was like, let's go do this. She's like, okay, I've scouted out this dance class. We're gonna go to this dance class.
Yeah.
So I show up, I'm like 10 minutes late. She's not there. I walk in and I don't realize there's actually 2 rooms in the gym. And you have to walk through the first room to get to the second room, which is where the novice class is. So I end up in an advanced professional modern dance class.
Not even the intermediate professional.
No. Advanced professional modern dance class. Yeah. So I'm in this class. There's 18 women, 2 gay men, and me. And I'm about 70 pounds heavier than anybody else in the room. And they're doing their warm-up, which is choreography, right? It's just, they have a choreo. Their warm-up is just dance. It's just a choreographed routine. And so I'm just in the back trying to follow her along. And then she teaches an 8-movement phrase in which she never uses a word. She never says, this is a something.
Right.
This is how you do it.
Right.
Shows you the movement, and then she tells you how she wants you to express within the movement.
Right.
So then there was another 8 movements. Then there was another 8 movements. Then there was another 8 movements. So 2 hours later, we have a 32 movement choreo piece that we're expected to replicate.
Yeah.
And I have no fucking idea what's happening. But luckily that first day, it was a lot of ground movements. So all the movement culture stuff, all the parkour warm-ups I'd done, all the systema, it kind of like propped me along.
Right.
So I walked up to her afterwards and I was like, I don't know if this is the right class for me. She's like, I want you to keep coming. So for 6 weeks, I was in this advanced dance class. And it was the hardest class I've ever taken. It was absolutely absurd. And after that, I was really obsessed with that capacity of dancers to absorb new material because it was so outside the scope of anybody else that I experienced. And I do think it's a really extraordinary ability. I think that people who specialize in dancers have major lacunae in other areas in the same way. But that's something that's really, really useful to think about. How can I get a piece of that? For sure. I totally agree.
I'm curious, and I have my own ideas on this. I'm curious what you would say the weakness of dancers, and let's say contemporary dancers. Yeah. So, I mean, what parkour is extraordinary at, like one of the things it's extraordinary at is getting you to deal with fear, right? Right.
Absent things.
Yes.
I don't think that someone who comes from dance is going to easily handle jumps at height.
Yep.
And I also think they're not going to easily handle confrontation. Some of the crazier aspects of contact improv might transfer better to like a fight scenario.
But even then,
most dancers are
probably not
ready for contact. Not going to go play football well.
Yeah.
But I think a football player could go do some dance and find an interesting transfer to their football player playing.
I didn't have that experience. Maybe some others might, but
you hear that story, right? Like, this running back, does ballet in the off season. And it's
right.
One thing I think contemporary dance in particular does really well is get you comfortable contacting the ground.
Yeah.
And so that's something that's really valuable. I think it's actually really surprising how many team sport athletes don't have good vocabulary for and sensitivity to hitting the ground and recovering off the ground. Parkour, all the like locomotions disciplines, contemporary dance system are all great for that.
Yeah.
So the way that I have conceptualized things, I think of movement as moving from a sort of utilitarian to expressive framework. And that if you go back to that original idea of locomotion, manipulation, interaction, I think that dance is at every level.
Mm-hmm.
And that some people actually are much more psychologically set up to be oriented towards dance, and it's much easier to actually get them into any practice of movement by orientating them through dance. So in our seminars, we actually use contact dance to introduce all of the kind of roughhousing stuff. So before we ever let people grapple, we have them dancing together.
Yeah.
And we found that just completely changes the dynamics and gets rid of so many of the problems you see in spazzy early white belt style sparring.
Right.
So yeah, I'm not that much of a dancer myself. Like, I admire it, but when I'm widening, I'll bring in dance. But when I'm but I always kind of end up narrowing down to parkour and MMA, and then strength training is just to keep me going on those things. Right.
When you say you see movement going from utilitarian to expressive, do you mean that over time, on the whole, the culture? No. Or do you see that on an individual level? What do you?
I just think that there's a spectrum in the expression of the movement, right? So locomotion, right? Like Ido Portal style locomotion is in a lot of ways is like dance stripped of, it's like contemporary dance stripped of a lot of its expressive elements.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can play with all of the patterns that you see in floreo locomotion in a dance setting.
Right.
In the same sense, you could add obstacles and now you're doing parkour, but you can dance the parkour. Right. You can do, say, kettlebell juggling, right? You could turn it into a dance.
Right.
Dance with a contact ball, dance with a broom, Fred Astaire.
Right.
And obviously you can dance with the people. Right. And you can even dance in ways that mimic and contain elements of combat. That's what capoeira is. In fact, many, many forms of dance are actually very, very linked into the martial arts of the culture that they derive from.
Right. Would you say Sistema is like that as well?
Possibly. I'm not sure about the link between it, but there's an interesting way in which the ground engagement training in Sistema is very like the ground practices of contemporary dance.
Right. Yeah.
So that's my perspective on dance. It's not so much one of the, it's weird. It's like an umbrella.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Rather than a pillar. So it wouldn't be you do parkour, you do martial arts, you do this, and you dance. It's dance can exist within all of them.
Yes. Do you know Shira?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shira.
There's so one of those lines, but so she's over here in Berkeley.
Yeah.
And so I moved to SF a month or two ago. So I've been going up there almost every week.
Is she actually in Berkeley right now?
I believe so.
Okay.
I mean, I think I saw her last week.
At the athletic playground. Okay, you saw her last week. Okay.
Yeah. So
for a while. Anyways,
she could be out this week, but
okay, sorry. This is unimportant to the people listening to the podcast. But yeah, Shira's awesome. Go play with Shira for sure. So tell me about what you're experiencing with Shira.
I went to sit next to her, and was like, do you want to dance? And she's like, we're already dancing. It's one of those the same. You can definitely see it as an umbrella. I kind of see this both though, because for me, I'm always investigating. Whenever I see someone that's good at a particular movement, good at movement overall, any of it, I always just grill them. What have you been doing? What's your movement history? How have you practiced this? What led to this? And yeah, so far I've been really impressed with how I've seen dancers pick up new disciplines, even far related ones, even the grappling and weightlifting that you would think would be much farther. And so, like there's definitely weaknesses. And I think the ones you raised were mostly like at a somatic level, right? That on that somatic, and that's quite interesting, right? And let's say that's in dance in general, but like on that somatic level, dance very much does not prepare you for like you mentioned, like fear at all, or combat really at all, and yet, like if you already had enough predisposition to try that, I've seen dancers pick up, very quickly, grappling and things that I've had quite a bit of.
Okay, go ahead.
For me, I think one of the physical things that I've seen in dancers is they seem to have a very hard time with like, I call this a software side, and maybe we'll get into this, but one of the software axes of movement of like explosive force production. I'm not actually like how strong you are, but like there's a certain coordination that you use to produce force explosely or large amounts of force.
They're not good at being stiff. They're very good at being yielding. They're not good at being stiff.
And I've found like, some of these very high level dancers, like, and they pick up these movements so fast, but to have the nuance of like the triple extension in like a clean, like somehow it escapes them, it's just because my theory is they've just never really had to do that, I
think it might be actually, so you have positive transfer and you have negative transfer, right? Where you'll often, like gymnasts pick up many things really well, but one thing that's very hard to teach many gymnasts is actually to do a shoulder roll.
Like a forward roll, like a judo.
Yeah.
As opposed to the way they do like over.
They will return to the pattern of, and they're very, actually, like many gymnasts are extremely stuck in sagittal plane movements.
Interesting.
So, or they're very bad at off axis.
Yeah.
So I struggle with this myself because I have a gymnastics background.
Yeah.
Learning to flip off axis. So like doing a corkscrew where your leg is, close to horizontal, super unnatural for me. Right. Much more like get that leg straight overhead and do a full twist there. And I've seen that a lot in gymnasts. Gymnasts have absorbed a frame in which proper movement is done, basically perfectly sagittal, perfectly frontal, perfectly transverse, and you never mix them up.
Yeah.
And, trickers obviously have this much wider scope of planar movements available to them. And that can actually be weird for a gymnast to try and pick up. And so I think in the same sense, what you might be seeing, like, I haven't noticed this in dancers, but like in yogis are the least elastic and powerful people that you'll meet because they've literally turned off their stretch shortening cycle. And I think if a dancer is focused on yielding and that beautiful sensitivity and movements they have, the type of tensioning that's associated with doing a clean might be contrary to them in the same way that doing a forward roll or a shoulder roll is contrary for a gymnast. I mean, one thing you'll see a lot, another example is the turnout, the foot turnout and the foot point. So, yeah, but I mean, most dancers have some level of ballet background. So like I've had some circ athletes who I worked with who did parkour with me. And I had this one young woman who had a big dance background, and like every time her feet left the ground, they were perfectly pointed, right? So she's doing a vault, her feet are pointed, everything's pointed. And it's actually like inhibiting her ability to just move fluidly and powerfully. Right? Like she's not able to get into the plantar, slightly dorsal comes up position to hit the ground with power. Like arms, like gymnast arms, you'll see that kind of thing in dancers as well. They have very specific gait patterns that are based on grace and beauty and not speed and power.
Right.
So there is those kinds of negative transfer levels.
Yeah. Would you say So I think what Paul Quinn calls it is like this interference effect.
Yeah.
But would you actually say that you've seen some of these athletes that, let's say the transfer is so bad, like they have such a hard time with this new thing, that you'd think they would actually have been better off? They would learn that movement faster or be able to do it better faster if they had never done their sport before.
For sure. I think that it's easier. It's often easier to teach a total novice to do a shoulder roll than a gymnast. And like people run, like it's not that, like it's harder to teach someone to run well who's been taught to run in a way that, like, really drilled for like hundreds of thousands of repetitions. A gait pattern that's not effective in an actual athletic situation. Or a landing pattern, right? So like if you're used to landing in second position all the time,
right?
Like, I mean, think about how many times a ballet dancer will have landed like that.
Right.
And then you come into a parkour context and you want to get them to land with their feet relatively straight ahead and to be able to hinge with their hips more. It's like you're now having to do so much counter programming compared to where they've been.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I feel like people generally, I feel like that concept is like abused.
How so?
As an excuse for why you have to learn something the correct way, you know, and that's why you have to train with me, you know, like,
I get what you mean. Yeah.
You know,
if you don't get you're grooving in the wrong patterns. You're not doing it.
Yeah.
But like this other thing is like contemporary dance is not ballet, and it's also not like swing dance. So
right.
Say dance, like we're actually describing a lot of very different things. And so I think contemporary dancers are much more adaptable, high transfer than ballet dancers.
Totally.
I had a conversation when I was first starting thinking about all this stuff back in like 2006 at a regional gymnastics camp with a Cirque du Soleil recruiter. And I was talking about CrossFit had said that like gymnasts were the athletes who learn sports fastest. And he was saying, like at Cirque, what you have is you have athletes from all these different sub-disciplines that are just hanging out. And what will happen a lot is that someone will come up with a random movement challenge.
Yeah.
What he said was the athletes who were the best at solving random movement challenges were capoeiristas.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is certainly not, definitely not what I would have guessed that they would say.
I mean, it's one guy's anecdote, but I thought about it for a long time. And I think there's some interesting reasons why capoeira is like a sport that has a lot of near donors to it. It has a musical interaction, so it donates to dance.
Yeah.
Right? It's alive, right? You have to throw, like, unlike gymnastics where you have a pre-planned tumbling line, you have to be able to do your acrobatics.
Yeah.
There. It's a amplification of complexity, right? So you're getting better at it by adding more and more complex moves. So you're getting that challenge to learn novel movement stimulations over and over again. It involves interaction with a partner.
Yeah.
It involves elasticity and power on the legs and with the upper body. So that gives it a lot of positive transfer potential. And it's both cooperative and competitive.
Yeah.
Because there's a rhythm that you do with the partner in addition to having the competitive aspect, which is a very weird liminal space.
Yeah.
So I do like capoeira as one of the core disciplines. But I think the game is much more important than the patterns.
Interesting.
So I wanted to go to the motor learning stuff because we haven't really touched deeply on that. Your critique of movement culture has a lot to do with the motor learning perspective is kind of not up to date with the current science. So you've been talking about optimal theory. I actually wasn't familiar with optimal theory. I'm familiar with, I think, with a lot of the stuff that goes into it, right? So I know about perception action coupling and ecological dynamics and external focus of attention and athlete autonomy. But I hadn't seen that framework of putting kind of all those things together. And also the psychological aspect, right? Enhanced effectivities. So tell us a little bit about your perspective on optimal theory, how you're applying that to movement, and where you see it kind of not like where are the failure points you're seeing? Why is that something that's so needed within the movement community?
So in a way, I feel like it's one is like a damn shame. Like even someone like yourself hasn't heard it. It's like, what the hell what is going on? That like
Gabriel Wolf, right?
You know? Huh?
Gabriel Wolf was the researcher.
Yeah. Wolf and Luthwaite.
Yeah. So Wolf is the main mentor of Nick Winkelman, I think, he's my main guy on external cues, who I've had on my podcast multiple times. He's a big influence.
Nice. Yeah. Seems like a guy to have.
Yeah.
So so basics of optimal theory is like my understanding of it is kind of centered around focus on task goal.
Yeah. So
basically anything that increases focus on task goal is going to increase performance in learning. And so then Wolf's theory was basically like, okay, we've got all this basic stuff of like how learning works, but like this hasn't accounted for like attention and intrinsic motivation. And hence it's incomplete, and hence it needs to be accounted for. And so these three big things that she's bringing to the table that contribute to focus on task goal are attentional focus, so internal or external focus cues, autonomy, so like how do people that they have to do what you tell them, that this is your structure, this is how it works, this is what you've got to do, because otherwise you're going to have bad patterns and then you're going to have negative transfers.
You'll have reverse motor engineering.
Exactly. Or that like these are some ideas that you've had, but maybe they could come up with something better, right? And like this is a starting point, and this is more of like a playground of a framework for you to explore with, right? Like those are two completely different mindsets. So we have autonomy, yes, and then the third one is expectancies.
Yep.
So how well, and this was, I think for me, the most counterintuitive of the bunch. This was quite interesting for me.
Coming from Ido, I can imagine why it would be.
Yeah. Well, so there's an interesting thing here. And anyway, so the basic definition first, like expectancies is, you have a task, right? One of the studies that was quoted in the optimal theory paper was like a golf task, right? So I get two groups of people, and give them a club, and you say, okay, like you're gonna try to putt the ball or whatever, shoot it, hit it. I don't know what exactly distance they were doing, but you're gonna try to get the ball into this circle, right? Here's the hole. Try to get it within this circle, and then they had two different groups. So one of them, the circle was really big, right? So it's like, okay, this is an approachable goal, and so that group is thinking in their head, their expectancy is better because they're told. Basically getting within that circle is good.
Yeah.
So if they're thinking, okay, I think I can do better than that, right? They're thinking like already they're expecting to do well. Versus the other group, they had a smaller circle, right? They were told like what is a good performance was a higher bar. They had to hit it within a smaller radius of this hole. And hence, their expectancies were lower. They're thinking in their heads, I don't know if I'll be able to do that, right? Maybe I'm not good at this before they start. And so the group with bigger circle, the higher expectancies, they had the same target, they had the same task, but the group that expected they would do better, essentially relative to the norm, actually did better.
Yep.
You know? And then so what happens is, with any of the things in kind of optimal theory, like basically, if you do well on the task, that feeds back into the expectancies.
Mm-hmm.
So it creates this like virtuous cycle, they call it, of you do the task, you do well, you have feedback. I know I can do it well because I just did it well. That increases your expectancies. And hence, that's going to further increase your focus on task goal. It's going to further increase your performance and learning. It's this great virtuous cycle. Versus the other way, you do the task, you do it badly, and you have evidence you did it badly, so you're expecting to perform it worse. You do it again. There's less focus on task goal, probably because you're thinking about how bad you are.
Mm-hmm. Self-conscious.
Yeah, and now you do even worse again, and it's a vicious cycle now.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's a pretty interesting one. And one of the things where I expect there's some complexity is there's so many high-level coaches and teachers, like Ido being one of them, that they completely they don't set they set the expectancies really low.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you come in and it's like, yeah, you try a handstand, they're not like, this is good. It's like, you'll be good when you can do a one arm for 30 seconds on each side. And until then, like,
weaker than a mosquito's fart.
Exactly. So, so I expect there's some sort of complexity with, there's so much of that's so common in really high level teachers that I wonder if there's some sort of exception there. Like, if for most people it's worse if you give them like lower expectancies, but then you motivate some of them to keep going. Like,
I think, yeah, I mean, there's so many threads I want to pick up here. It's really fascinating conversation. So I actually do think that negative information, we're actually attuned to negative information more. So negative information has a higher salience and can have more impact on us.
Right.
So there is a way in which, when it's properly formulated, the negative is going to penetrate more deeply than positive.
Right.
So if it's well designed, a tool, right?
Yeah.
I was talking to my therapist this morning about the fact that I have extraordinary propositional memory. I can remember, like the date that England was invaded, right? 1067,
right.
Whatever.
Nice.
Like those things pop into my head really easily. What I don't have is very good episodic memory. So my wife's memory of her childhood is very rich and has lots of detail. My memory of my childhood is very vague. My memory of like 10 years ago is pretty vague. And so what I was realizing was that like it makes it hard for me to learn certain lessons because like I can't sustain a negative emotional frame for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what motivates people is like, get away from pain. But if you can't remember the pain that you felt, you won't sustain the changed behavior, right? There's like a research on this in rats and motivation, right? So you tie a spring to a rat's tail,
right?
And it has a door that it can access. So you can put, it's a male rat, and you put the smell of a female in estrus on the other side. How hard does it pull? Right. Then you put the smell of a cat, right behind it. How hard does it pull? Well, the rat will pull the hardest when there's a fertile female on the other side and a cat behind it. Right. Best to have the carrot and the stick.
Right. That's great.
The problem with negative, like if you look at like the theory of training dogs, they'll talk about operant conditioning, right? So you can remove something positive, so that's negative punishment. You can add something positive, that's positive reward. You can add something negative, that's positive punishment, and you can remove something negative, that's positive negative reward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Many trainers now are just, they're positive plus as much as possible, because the downside of negative, it's not that it doesn't work, it's that it often has negative side effects.
Yes.
So if you hit your dog when it raises its leg to pee in the house, you might get it to not pee in the house, but you might also decrease its trust in you and also amplify its general anxiety.
Yeah.
So there's some complexity there. But the other aspect of that is that I think that there's ways in which you can get people to be psychologically reliant on you by being abusive of them. And so I think a lot of very successful coaches are successful basically because of Stockholm syndrome. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, this is going to really be controversial there. So when I first started coaching, when I first started the EMP, I was doing a lot of online coaching, and probably 70% of my students were ex-Ido students.
Yeah.
And I would ask them like what your programming would be, and they would send me the program they were on with Ido, and it'd be like 4 hours a day of ring strength and hand balancing. And everyone who came to work with me was basically broken by it.
Right.
And they all had elbow tendonitis. And
all medial.
Yeah. So I was like, I would just strip 90% of the volume out of their program, and then start adding some cool parkour stuff into it. And they'd be like, well, I'm having fun and it's rewarding and I'm not in pain. This is pretty great. We're still making gains. But I started having this idea that like, so if you spent $1,200 on a piece of paper, and then were psychologically abused by the people who gave you the piece of paper, and you abuse yourself for 12 weeks to make it to the end of this piece of paper, like, you're either a sucker or it had to be the best program ever. And if you put 4 hours in, it's probably going to have an impact, right? It doesn't have to be very optimized to have a huge impact when you put that much volume in. So I call this the Stockholm syndrome theory of
movement culture.
Student retention, that's what it calls it. But yeah. And then it's a meat grinder, right? Like, because there's a lot of people who burn out of it, but the people who go through it, they're so devoted to it at the end of it, because it's a sunk cost fallacy problem, right? You've put so much in.
Yeah.
If you don't actually think it was worth much, you have to question your own decision making.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah. No, there's a lot there.
Sorry.
No, this is great.
I didn't mean to make it just an Ido bashing session, but
we like Ido.
I actually think Ido is genuinely brilliant, and I feel like I've learned so much by disagreeing with Ido.
Yeah.
Like, I think he's like, because he's so articulate and so charismatic, like I said, I did that quote earlier about it. It's your patterns, bro. It's like,
yeah,
that made me understand why I disagreed with it better, because he said it.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is the way science goes generally, right? It's like we move further through the disagreements.
Yeah. It's component processing.
Yeah. So, and so this is like one of my critiques of how like movement culture teaching is structured, of like, it's very much not focused on autonomy. Like it's controlling language, right? So the controlling language just in the literature, like, is something you can actually study, of like, you give someone a cue.
Sorry, the phrase "whore shoppers" is just like demanding to be expressed.
Whore shoppers?
Whore shoppers, never heard that one? That's
no.
Like people who train with other movement teachers.
Okay. I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, good one. Okay, go on.
Yeah, so things like that, right?
That would be controlling language.
Yes. That would even be like meta controlling language, something like that. But like, so you give someone a task, and basically you give them the same task in two ways. You either say step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you must do it exactly like this. Or like you can give them the same instructions, but like step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, these are ideas, right? And so that's the controlling language versus autonomy supported language. And what you see when you actually study that and have both groups and see who does better, the autonomy supported language group does better.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that in the movement culture and in a lot of martial arts cultures is very absent. Not completely absent, but extremely absent, So that's one huge thing that I think we can be doing better. External focus. Another thing, like in a way, it comes down to like there's no awareness of optimal theory.
It's interesting. Like I was reading the description of optimal theory, and it's like very much like what I'm trying to do with my son, right?
Yeah.
And it was like, oh yeah, I get it. That's what I'm trying to do. It was actually confirming because like I'm so positive. Like I was just like I get really excited about things, and I try not to say that. Oh, I don't say much that's negative, right? And I was like,
yeah.
Am I being too nice?
Yeah.
I was like, no. Enhance the effectivities. It actually kind of like it feels a little bit like a combination of. I mean, it's definitely like a bit of ecological dynamics type approaches, right? The external focus aspect. And then it actually feels like it's congruent with play research, which has been a big area of my focus. And it's like, okay, that idea of intrinsic drive, autotelic things, flow, right? Going back to flow, like the idea of enhanced effectivities. One of the things we talk about is like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talked about the difference between like, you can have like objective metrics of progress,
right?
Or you can have subjective metrics of progress. So you can actually change your experience of flow or your degree of anxiety by creating a more refined mental model of what success looks like. So the example that I always give is like, let's say you're like 115-pound, relatively weak person who shows up for jiu-jitsu for the first time, and you happen to go into a gym where like it's mostly experienced, strong, athletic people, right? It's like you're going to get crushed every day.
Right.
So in the play research, they find that if you succeed less than 30% of the time, you lose motivation to engage in profitable play in particular. So you can imagine that a lot of people go to jiu-jitsu and they do not tap out their opponent 30% of the time. They don't even succeed in not getting tapped 30% of the time in the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. So if you make the objective just tap or be tapped, like there's going to be a huge group of people who are just who are not going to be successful enough soon enough and are going to get burned out of the sport.
Right.
So what those people need is actually to adopt a mindset of small wins. Right. So Rafe comes over, he threatens the cross collar choke, he gets you in the armbar, does that every day. You're pissed off. So you say, okay, I'm not going to tap him, but he's not going to armbar me today.
Yeah.
Right. Or he's only going to armbar, or he's not going to armbar me as many times.
This is more likely. Yeah.
Right. So it's like, okay. So I got tapped a bunch, but it went from 6 times to 3 times.
Yeah.
That's my win. Right.
Yeah.
50% less tapping is my win.
Yeah.
Right. Or he had to go to the rear naked choke instead of the armbar. Right. And so that's the type of things you have to be able to adopt as wins. And I think so that's the psychological education of the enhanced effectivities.
Yeah.
And it also reminds me of like placebo research. I was listening to Lane Norton on Andrew Huberman's podcast, and he was saying that you have 3. They did a a research group where they had like 3 groups doing strength training, a control group, a control group doing nothing, a group on testosterone, and a group on mock testosterone.
Yeah.
And the group on mock testosterone improved almost as much relative to the control group as the group on actual testosterone.
Yeah.
So there's also research that shows like if you trick people into thinking they ran faster than they ran, they will actually run faster at the end of a training cycle, which is like, this gets to
yeah.
like how much do you want to delude your students, right?
It was a hell of a thing.
Yeah. So the placebo is, and so what happens though is if you think of it as placebo and you recognize the concept of nocebo, right? That we have the power to go in the opposite direction. A lot of this negative, highly controlling language is actually acting as a nocebo, right? All this like, oh, your movement patterning is broken. All those things, those are like, oh, if you keep running with your feet turned out, you're going to have terrible pain. Your knees are going to fall apart.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Self-fulfilling prophecies.
Totally.
So I've been, so the virtuous and vicious cycle, right? So my son is 8 years old and he can do 15 pull-ups. He has a 19-inch approach vertical, 14-inch standing vertical.
Wow.
He can do an L-sit, press to a tuck plunge. He's getting very close to doing like a strict parkour climb up.
Yeah.
You do double kongs.
Wow.
He's done an 8-foot wall run, and he can do backflip to backflip on the trampoline, front flips. And so it's very interesting because I've been taking him to the ninja gym for a long time, and we were doing parkour classes with him, and he wasn't really enjoying it. So we dropped him from parkour classes, and we just took him to open gym. So he had total autonomy. He could determine his time.
Yeah.
And then slowly I started just saying, here's a challenge. Do you want to try this? And like, there were times when he was like really mad at me for challenging him because he felt like I was forcing him to do something. And every time I would say, it's just a challenge. Like you can do it or not do it.
Yeah.
And like, so we went through multiple cycles of like me inviting him into stuff, him feeling like it was an expectation, and me having to tell him there was no expectation. He can choose to do whatever he wants. But then over time, it's like, he comes up to me in the gym and says, hey, Dad, can we work on something?
Nice.
Right? Like, let's go work on this. I want to get my level 3 climb.
Right.
And so he's selecting to have me coach him. And when we do that, external focus of attention on the skills, right? He's doing backflips, look at the wall, grab your legs. And tons of feeding him positive. Every time, like one of the big things you see is that he'll self-select like a very strict criteria of success. And I'll have to be like, no, actually what you did was really successful, even though it wasn't exactly what you set out to do.
Nice.
And then that, so we have the autonomy too, right? It'll be like, yesterday we were at the ninja gym and I was like, okay, here's a challenge. Do a seat drop, bounce to your feet, immediately do a backflip, land, bounce once and do a front flip.
Nice.
And then he just gets to choose whether he wants to do it or not. And then it's like, oh, does that sound interesting? Would you like to try that? And it's like, okay, I'm dialed in. So I really like that framework. And I think it's really interesting. The flip side I wanted to touch on is, so my daughter is 10 years old and I try to approach things the same way with her, but she has this problem, which is that her brother is learning faster than her, even though he's younger than her. And she sees him getting a lot of praise and attention for how skillful he is. So she's actually, she can do 12 pull-ups, right? But the fact that like almost none of the adults she's around and none of the children she's around can do 12 pull-ups is completely irrelevant to her because so we'll all be at the ninja gym and we're all having fun.
Yeah.
And Kier will run up to Audrey because he's excited about what he's done and say, hey, Audrey, come watch me. She'll see him and she'll get upset internally at herself for feeling like she's not able to do what he's doing. So what we've been trying to do more and more is actually just like take them separately.
It's a brute force solution.
Yeah, because just like remove that salience, right? And kids are like that so much.
Yeah.
You can see that negative circle. She becomes self-conscious of the fact that he's able to do something slightly better than her, which inhibits her performance. And now she's also selecting these more constrained is it effectivities? Expectancies. Sorry, expectancies. So her expectancies are now conditioned on him.
Yeah.
Right? Which is causing her to become self-conscious. And
this is another thing. I think that I don't think I've talked about anywhere, but I think it's really important of like, if you're trying to play someone else's game, you're kind of always going to lose. Yeah. Like if she's always trying to like to generalize, let's say, but if you're always trying to select something that like to try to do something that someone else did that they're good at, like.
I mean, yes and no, because it has a lot to do with expectation, because my youngest, Katie, is scaling up in physical skill really rapidly, right? She's about to turn 5. She just did she was able to do a front flip to her butt off of like a 2-foot platform down to an air mattress yesterday. And it's like, this is a huge, huge thing for her. She can do 2 pull-ups already, She's got an 8-inch work loop. She's absurd, but she's younger, so she doesn't have she has no expectation of being able to do what her brother does. She only has the pull of seeing it. So she has the aspirational aspect without the negative self-consciousness aspect of it.
Yeah.
So you can have people who you're comparing yourself to, who are aspirational, who pull you. But when you become hyper competitive with like peer level, then that can really drag you down.
Yes. And I also think like there's a difference between like that pull can also be like, if that pull is towards someone else's strengths and someone else's inclinations rather than your own.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I do know what you're saying. I mean, I think it's interesting. So I think that's part of what we're struggling with my oldest daughter, is she's just not as motivated by sport as my 2 younger children are. Right. So she's very good. She's very athletic naturally, but it's just not as exciting for her. And because my son is more excited than her, he does more of it, and he does it at higher intensity. So if we go to the ninja gym, Kier's he's going to be playing as hard as possible with complete focus the entire time.
Right.
And Audrey is not going to be, right? And then she's upset with herself because she doesn't achieve the same things, but it's like, it's not because he's not necessarily more talented just like in a physical sense. It's much more about a motivational frame.
Yeah.
And so it's a struggle, because I want her to get the skills. I want her to grow. I want her to be able to take advantage of being in this environment, but I also want her to like be affirmed that she doesn't have to have the same desires as everybody else.
Yeah.
Right? She doesn't have to have the same drives. So like with Katie, she does. She has that, that's her, right? She, like, if we watch a Jackie Chan movie, like the Katie and Kier, the 2 younger ones, like they can't watch more than like 10 minutes of Jackie Chan without jumping up and like vaulting and flipping and jumping and kicking all around the living room, right? Like they have this natural inclination to want to mimic those things, right?
Yeah.
And Audrey's not as much like that. So, it's an interesting thing. I wanted to, I guess we're kind of running low on time. Like I had a lot more topics. I kind of assumed that this was going to happen, so we wouldn't make it through. most of the topics that I had, because it would go in lots of other directions. But I did want to talk about volume. One of the things that you have talked about is the secret to what makes the sauce of movement culture and excellence is just volume.
Yeah.
So I think this is interesting because I also enjoy the work of Philip Chubb. I'm sure you know Philip Chubb, the Mindful Mover, right?
Yeah.
So Philip is basically the anti-volume guy. How can I get rid of as much volume as possible?
Yes.
And I think there's actually really important insight in that. Like, how do we address the minimal effective dose? But ultimately, I think for skill work, there's no way to get there faster without doing more until you're doing more to the point that your body can't handle it.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about your approach to volume and how you experienced it with movement culture and how you think we can intelligently approach that.
And I also want to address just with as far as like the minimal effective dose. Maybe we'll come back to it. So
minimal effective dose, I think, is a really, really valuable concept to think about in becoming a minimalist, a generalist as well, right? But yeah, we can come back to that.
Yeah. Well, okay, but now maybe not. You piqued my interest. I can't stay away. So there's something like one of the things I find, because I used to be like very into this whole like Tim Ferriss, Pareto principle, minimum effective dose, like that whole line of thought. In a way, for me, and both what I've seen in other people, as intelligent as it sounds, I think it leads to a very stagnant mindset. If you're always looking to do less, to get more out of less.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
It puts you in a different place because I think one of the things like, say you can do 20% of the volume and you maintain your strength, right? Okay, you can do that for a week and a month. But now what happens after 6 months, right? Like that was enough volume to maintain for a short period of time, maybe over a longer time. Now you're actually starting to go backwards. And then what happens? You have an injury, you have a setback of whatever kind. And now you didn't have this habitual volume. Your body wasn't used to it. And now you have a big significant drop in physical capability. And then it can become really hard to get anywhere near back where you were, you know? I think a lot of what you get with the extra effort, the 80% of the effort that gets you 20% of the results is growth. You know, the growth is the hardest thing to get.
So there's a couple things I want to touch on there. One, I think, is when I first encountered Tim Ferriss's stuff, I had I think a similar reaction.
Yeah.
And a lot of the biohacking stuff also. It's like, I remember when Tim tried to learn parkour in a week, he just broke himself, right? That was just a dumb idea.
He did the Kong and then he like hurt his knee and then it was over, right?
Yeah, something like that. No, it's bad plan. I think that there's an advantage to patience and to the accepting of a slow process.
Yes.
So I think,
and to accepting effort.
Yeah, and to accepting effort. So I think there's a lot of truth to that, of like, to this idea of like, accept that some of the things that you want to do just can't be hacked. They just need effort.
Yeah.
And I also think this comes to the 80-20 rule, right? So if you want to be the best in the world at something, like on some level, you want to find all the 20% that get you to 80, and you want to sort of like stack those as much as possible.
Right.
But there's also this element of it, which is just like, there's going to be a diminishing return on those. And at some point you just have to do 100% because it's what it is. Right. So like we go back to like the Vasily Lomachenko punching tennis balls, right?
Yeah.
I think this is less than 1% of what makes him successful.
Right. Easily.
But if you're Vasily Lomachenko, you know that the next guy is also doing 99% of everything, or 99.9% of everything that you could possibly do to be the best boxer in the world. So what you're looking for is actually like marginal solutions that will get you a tiny improvement.
Yeah.
Right. And if you want to be really, really great at something, you have to like explore the shallow end of the Pareto distribution. You just don't get there otherwise.
Yes.
You got to squeeze everything out of the juice. The 80-20 thing, though, I think is interesting when you're a generalist. Because I'm not going to squeeze 100% out of the MMA thing. So I really, really need to be attuned to what the 20% is.
Yeah.
I'm not going to squeeze 100% out of the dance thing. I need to be attuned to what the 20% is. So I think it's a very useful way of framing and looking at being a generalist. I would also say, like, in Philip's defense, Philip would say, I think he's been doing this for 3 or 4 years and he's been getting consistently stronger, right?
He says that. I don't want to get into personal stuff, but
okay. He doesn't seem weak to me.
He's definitely not weak.
Okay. Now, but I will say this, which is, I think tolerance to volume is an important adaptation to the pursuit of excellence in any physical thing.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
When I was coaching gymnastics, we used to have the team boys, their warm up for the day was, they'd run around the gym a couple times, and then they do over-unders on the beams, like probably, I don't know, for a minute or so. Then they would climb a 20-foot rope 3 times. They would do a minute handstand hold 3 times. They do 3 sets of 15 pull-ups, 3 sets of 30 push-ups, and 3 minutes of hollow body, 3 1-minute segments of hollow body and arch body rocks. That was not their strength training.
Right.
Right. That was their warm-up.
Right.
And I've always been like that. That's such an advantage going forward, because you can kind of throw anything at an athlete who succeeded at that, and you're not going to exceed their capacity to adapt. Right? If that's a baseline level of effort that doesn't even fatigue you, then you got a lot of headroom.
Right.
Right. You've got, in some sense, building your tolerance to volume just gives you, it's like money in the bank that can then be spent on skill acquisition.
Yes.
But the flip side to that is that when you're a 12-year-old boy who's training gymnastics all the time, that's a very different situation than when you're like a 35-year-old who has a family, 3 kids. I've had to adopt a lot of minimalism, because it's like, I can't, if I can get 80% of the benefit of my strength training by doing 1 set, I can't, I'm just going to do 1 set because that's all I have time for.
Right. I feel like it's a little bit, maybe these will sound contradictory, but I think there's a difference in the perspective. Like you say, it's so much more tempting as a generalist to start looking at where can we find this 80-20, right? We can't even get close to the 100% of one thing, especially if you have a job, and especially if you have a family and a job. And now if we want to do all of these things, now we can't do 500%, right? We have to cut down somewhere.
Yeah.
But for me, maybe this is more of a life philosophy than a training thing. But for me, I find a lot more value in thinking of doing what I can and knowing the value of the things, rather than what can I cut away because it's too much effort, and doesn't seem to be getting me the enough reward or enough result. So yeah. And I think there's something that naturally comes out of like this sort of craftsmanship's process of refinement of, say maybe you're training parkour 5 hours a day, maybe you're training 1 hour a day, whatever. But as you're doing that, you could be the dumbest guy, right? As you're doing that, you're going to figure things out that work better or worse, you know, and you're going to refine that process. That process is going to get better. And a lot of those things you will figure out, or very slowly or not at all, if you're doing 20 minutes every fourth day, because that's optimal for your tendons, you know?
To go back to the AI kind of computer engineering thing, what you're talking about is basically like, you need more iterations. You need more iteration cycles. The more iteration cycles you put in, basically the faster you're going to progress, which is, I mean, like there's a level on which that's true. And then there's also this problem, which is that the body has a physiological limit, right? And what happens a lot, and like, I was listening to you talk about this and I'm like, oh man, most people don't, you know, are not even near overtraining. And maybe for most like novices, that's true. But like, I've seen so many parkour athletes, like I would say that 90% of the injuries that I see are directly caused by overtraining. Right? You tear your Achilles because you didn't rest properly. You get elbow tendonitis because you didn't rest properly. And I've seen over and over again this sort of athletic trajectory of like, start training, get passionate, get really good, really, really fast, huge volumes, get an injury, regress, start putting the volume in, get an injury, regress, you know, over and over and over again. I mean, that was my experience. Like I went from, you know, basically a novice of parkour at 25 to, you know, pretty high level parkour athlete at 27. And then like 28 to 30, I had 2 back spasms, a neck spasm. I tore ligaments in both my feet. I subluxated my cuboid bone. I retore my rotator cuff, and I tore my Achilles tendon, and then I suffered a high ankle sprain. There's not a lot of progress between 27 and 30. It was pretty shit. Then I was able to like slow myself down. I went and trained with Ido, learned a lot about like joint rehab, put my work in, learned from Andrea Spina. And it was like 30 to 34 was like golden, killing it. 35. Then I had other health problems which have kind of sustained me. Those don't have anything to do with overtraining. Those have everything to do with like other lifestyle factors. But you know, I think that we need to be careful in talking about the ultimate value of like those iteration cycles and being really realistic about like, there are diminishing returns, right? You only have so many cycles you can run per day, and running more cycles may just result in a break that's gonna cause you to not be able to run cycles for a long time.
Yeah. So there's a few things here. So one, it is very clear there's a dose response. Like there's a dose response, there's some level of diminishing returns with volume. That's very clear. I've actually just been doing tons of research into strength training volume in particular. And so how much do we progress with different amounts of volume? And actually, it's shocking the number of studies that haven't shown at least a statistically significant difference between, say, like 1 set per exercise and like 3. If you're doing them, you know, say 3 times a week. So, you know, that's there. Like the 1 set per exercise at a quality intensity is a very powerful thing. You know, potentially, yeah, if you had that 80-20 mindset, you could start with that. Like even 1 set could be very beneficial.
I've had some really good progress doing workouts entirely composed of 1 set.
Yeah. It can be quite good. And so that's mostly in untrained people. And then so you can speculate that in trained populations, you need more volume. It's not super clear to what extent that is or where that is. still reading. I've been digging. My backpack is like, I should show you. It's literally, it's like filled with all these. There's like literally like half of them. So, I'll keep reading more, and maybe my perspective will change as I read more and more of these studies. But it also doesn't seem to be clear that there's an upper limit for where you don't get any further progress.
Interesting.
And so
I think that really depends on modality. Like, so I was looking at there was a paper that came out about the health impacts of walking.
yes.
Right. This found there's extremely sharp slope of health increases from 0 steps to 8,000 steps per day. And
Yes.
then 8,000 to 12,000, the slope is a little bit shallower, but still good.
Right.
And then it gets even shallower, but it goes all the way out to 24,000 steps per day. And the slope is always upward. There's no inflection point where you're actually walking too much.
Right.
But if you look at elite sprint coaches, they will often tell you, you just cannot put 100% effort out in a sprint within 72 hours of a previous all-out sprint.
Mm.
So the maximal value of 100% sprinting that you can do per week is 3 sessions.
Yeah, but then you also have high level who's the guy from the volume video I was talking about? Guys like John Bruce, right? Olympic weightlifting is, I would say, just as power dependent as sprinting. And he's every day, twice a day, right? You have the whole Bulgarian method,
Yeah, I think that one is definitely PEDs. I don't think you can sustain that without.
So this is a funny thing that when I posted that video, I thought there was going to be some significant pushback there, and no one really picked up on that. But yes, that is one of the potential complications of okay, well, he did have an enormous amount of success. The Bulgarian method, Ivan Abadjiev, John Bruce, and that whole system of things. But they also had a ton of steroid allegations, so it's.
Yeah. I mean, we know that everyone in elite sport is essentially on PEDs, or at least the majority, in my opinion.
I think there's a number I was seeing around 30%, but it's certainly significant. It's significant.
Yeah. I would suspect it's more 80%. I think you're if you're not on any kind of PEDs.
Yeah, I'm more optimistic, but
but I think there's some of these programs that we have to consider whether they're only possible with PEDs.
It's true. Yeah, it's true.
I was reading this really beautiful article about speed skating, and he was talking about in his perspective, you just basically can't overdose the aerobic system. So in his off season, the speed skater would train 5 or 6 hours of aerobic work.
Yeah.
But my experience, what I've read, when you're accessing higher threshold motor units, when you're sprinting, when you're doing these things, it's a different game. And that's what I worked with Mike Cunliffe for sprinting. Mike's daughter Hannah was 7-time national champion in her age class. We had Tatum Taylor, I think, on our team that year, who was the 3rd fastest 16-year-old in the country. 10:32.
Oh shit! 100-meter time?
Yeah.
Jesus.
10:32 at 16.
Jesus Christ!
We had a 27-foot long jumper. So it was good. It was a solid team, right?
Yeah.
And he said basically, if you're training under 70% of your maximal capacity, you're not exhausting your nervous system. You can essentially train every day.
Right.
And some of these weightlifting programs are like that. They're not actually lifting maximal loads.
Right.
Right. So it's like they're going in and they're just getting volume of that.
Right.
I think there are some successful sprint coaches who do more of a technical approach where they're getting a lot of volume at sub-maximal, or like, I think Derek Hansen's been talking about like just doing a ton of like relatively low volume sessions of like 10 meter accelerations. But yeah, the kind of most of the successful coaches that I know of or that I've been around or talked to in the sprint world are like, volume is very dangerous for sprinters. It's very easy to saw sprinters on volume. And also people who are great at sprinting don't tolerate volume well. People who are naturally good at sprinting have a very easy time accessing higher threshold motor units and become exhausted very easily.
Yeah, that would certainly make sense.
I was talking to a coach who was saying that like, so I did a bunch of CrossFit right before all those injuries that I was telling you about. Mm-hmm. So I was talking to this guy who used to be big in the CrossFit community and was working with a lot of ex-CrossFitters. And he was saying that like, he just calls it like post-CrossFit meltdown syndrome. Where you just see people who like, they just like all their soft tissue just starts breaking, a few years into CrossFit. And he said that his observation was that naturally aerobic dominant athletes can tolerate CrossFit and can train just buttloads of volume and they're fine, right? You just basically can't overtrain them. But highly phosphagen dominant athletes are relatively easy to overtrain.
Yeah. I mean, so these are
like Charlie Francis said that, Ben Johnson would run away. Like he would hide in the bathroom when they did longer distances. If you had to run a mile, Ben would. And eventually he learned like, oh, if I'm working with athletes like Ben, I'm just not going to use those type of interventions.
Yeah. So the complexity arises with the Euro studies that I mentioned. I think very briefly at the end of one of those Ido videos. So basically, this video I posted of the most important thing I learned from Ido Portal being like volume. That like if you want to make more progress, you do more volume. And so I actually held off on doing that. I had that idea for like, I don't know, 6-8 months. And I held off on it for a long time because I was like, I don't want to be pushing this if there's research to the contrary. Mm-hmm. I'm not, like Ido's saying this, it makes sense. It's worked for me. I see it working for a lot of people. However, I don't know what the science says. So I want to figure that out first. And so when I went to actually dig into it, I kind of did a review paper on overtraining. And it's very interesting, the research. Mm-hmm. So first of all, like, it's very hard to define like what overtraining is. Yeah. So there's like a few different definitions. So there's like, there's functional overreaching, mm-hmm. and there's non-functional overreaching, and then there's overtraining syndrome. Like, so these are like, this is kind of like the more classic categories, right? And so some of the early ones are easy to define. So functional overreaching being like, you kind of, so basically any of these, you're kind of seeing a increase in fatigue, a decrease in motivation, and most critically, you're seeing a decrease in performance with significant amounts of training volume.
Yeah. This was me yesterday.
Huh?
This is me yesterday. I had, I guess, 6 sessions in 8 days, right?
Yes.
So session 1 was great. I hadn't trained in 14 days because I got sick.
Right.
Such a good session. Session 2, kind of fatigued when I arrived, wasn't as excited, but once I warmed up, awesome session. Session 3, these are all parkour sessions.
Yeah.
Third session, same story as the second session. Progress. Finally get the skill that I've been working on for the last 6 months, right?
Nice.
Or last 3 months. So then I was kind of fatigued feeling, but my HRVs looked good. And so I was like, oh, I'm going to go in and do a strength training workout Monday.
Yeah.
And it was good. I was stronger. Then I went in and did my cardio workout the next day, mobility workout. And my cardio was like not stronger.
Yeah.
And then yesterday, my HRVs were still really good, which was weird because they always go down when I train. And I was like, well, I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to go into the gym. And so I went to the gym and I was just super unmotivated, didn't feel good, wasn't excited to play. Did some things, was like, I'm going to work on the skill. I'm going to work on the skill. So I worked on the main skill and I was excited because I was pleased because I was much less weak than I expected to be.
Yeah.
So I still regressed relative to Sunday.
Right.
But like my floor for my performance had risen relative to like a few weeks ago. But then I did a climb up and I felt pain in my forearm. I had like a forearm splint, and I was like, oh,
yeah,
not gonna play with pain.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's my personal experience. Like, okay, I overreached slightly.
Yeah. So functional overreaching is like pretty easy to define, pretty easy to see in the research, right? So you have people kind of train too much, their performance decreases, you back off the volume and you see their performance kind of rebound.
Yeah.
And you would generally say it would like super compensate. It would rebound more than it would have had you not done the extra training. Then there's the idea of non-functional overreaching, which is at some unspecified amount more volume or some unspecified more time or more fatigue or whatever, that it's more of this idea that this overtraining becomes no longer functional. Like it's no longer helpful. If you back off the volume,
you're not getting super compensation on the backside of the overtraining.
Yeah. Or you're certainly at least not getting any more super compensation, right? It's just any more that you let this go on, it's not helping you.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third kind of category being overtraining syndrome. And again, like it's somewhere like in an unspecified amount more, and it's like not clear what the difference is between overtraining syndrome and non-functional overreaching. But it's basically like it's somewhere more severe where potentially where you back off the training and now like this fatigue and this decreased motivation, this burnout, decreased performance, like may take months, if not like years to like come back.
I've been there too.
So it's very hard to define it. And one of the problems with things like this is like, it's not ethical to like do this to people, right? You can't get a study and say, all right, let's get everyone overtraining syndrome and then let's see how long it takes, right? So no one does it. And hence it's not well understood. But so there was a study that was, or kind of a series of studies that was very interesting. And to me, it was by far the best study that had been done on what seemed to be overtraining syndrome. Like it was basically they recruited like 40 high-level athletes that had overtraining syndrome, they called it. And they verified it in a few different ways. They had to like interview their coach, and the coach had to say that the coach had to like kind of like back everything up and suggest that they had, you know, some level of overtraining. And then they also did this thing I thought was funny. They weeded out, they actually called them in the paper like false athletes, which they defined as people, I think, training like less than 3 times a week for like 90 minutes a session, something like that. So they had to be training like a significant amount. I think they were training more than 2 hours a day for this study. And so then what they did is they did this assortment of like almost all the tests you could imagine, like all of these different blood tests, like blood tests. They looked at, I think they might have looked at urine. They looked at sleep quality. They looked at food. They looked at, they basically looked at mood. And so they tried to say training intensity, training volume. And so it's all correlational, right? It's all after the fact. But then they tried to say, okay, how do we figure out who had overtraining syndrome, right? We have these people with overtraining, and at least like as validated as we can be that it's overtraining, that's what we've got. And we've got also these kind of like healthy controls and athlete controls. And so what they found was that there was no correlation between training volume or intensity with the people that had overtraining, And so this is what I found that just, to me, was certainly enough validation to say, okay, like there at the very least is not evidence to say that Ido is wrong.
Sure. I mean, the thought that occurs to me right away there is like the threshold for overtraining would naturally be very individual, because it's going to be based on training history and the specific kind of.
But you would assume there'd be some correlation, even if it's individual.
Not necessarily. It wouldn't necessarily show up statistically in that kind of study, because if you just think about the variation in like natural variation in movement tolerance could be very wide. And then you think about the variation in training history and how much someone can, how much volume someone is used to. So if you think of it as a change in volume, like think about injury, right? Injury is just load that exceeds the capacity of the tissue to do it, right? You think of overtraining.
That's already very mechanical model of injury.
I mean, the like when you're talking about a mechanical injury, right? Like,
okay, we were talking about
failure of the Achilles tendon, it tears apart, right?
Okay. Already a small subset of injuries.
True. Fair enough. But my point is that you could model at least part of this as the athlete has exceeded their capacity to adapt to an increase in volume. The threshold at which you've exceeded that capacity and how deep you've gone into how far you've exceeded that capacity seems to me like it would be highly variable from athlete to athlete. So you wouldn't necessarily get a clear signal of you do 1,000 hour, everyone goes into overtraining if they do, 40 hours of training a week. Like I wouldn't expect that type of result at all. So a lot of times, with science, it's like the value of the evidence is really dependent on how you frame the questions. And a lot of times inter-individual variability muddies the water to the point where it's very, very difficult to get a clear answer, especially if you're questioning incorrectly.
Totally. Still, I would assume that you would see some correlation. Say, this is an interesting idea that you're raising, but the way I'm understanding it is like, imagine that there's a completely random threshold for people, like a certain training volume. Let's say all the hours of training are intense, and there's a certain training volume for each person that would cause overtraining. And maybe that's a number between, say, 0 and 40 hours per week. It's completely random, and everyone, like, the standard deviation is enormous.
It's not random. It's just impacted by a large amount of variables. It's going to be impacted by the athletes.
Yeah.
Training background, their metabolic system, and by their life circumstances.
Sure.
So my capacity to absorb new training volume when I'm 25 years old and don't have children and I'm not running my own business is going to be very different than, 35, working 8 hours a week, 3 children under 5 years old, right?
Yes.
So but the point is that it's going to be very, very hard to control for all of those factors in a study. And this is where the biopsychosocial model comes in, right? literally, like, okay, so one athlete breaks up with their girlfriend during the study.
Yeah.
It's like, doesn't have anything to do with their training volume.
Right. Right. Well, so this
but
was
it impacts the system's ability to adapt.
Yeah. So they didn't find any correlation between overtraining and training volume or intensity.
Yeah.
But they did see correlation between a number of factors. But also, so whether we imagine that a number of variables contribute to overtraining or if it's totally random, you would still see some correlation between. You should still see that. Again, like you're saying,
I think it's going to depend on the statistical power of the study.
Yes. It might not be powered enough in a sample of 40 people. That's totally fair.
Yeah.
But so what they did see correlation with that you were kind of touching on, they saw correlation between incidence of overtraining and 5 factors.
Yeah.
So they saw self-reported sleep quality, concurrent hours of like cognitively stressful activity, so like basically like work. Self-reported sleep quality, concurrent stressful hours, total calorie intake, total carb intake, and total protein intake. I believe those are the 5.
I'm still here.
Yeah. So they did see these correlations. It wasn't that they didn't see any correlation between anything in overtraining and it was totally random. But those are all factors that have more to do with recovery than, how much they were training. And so that's why they retermed overtraining. They recoined it as paradoxical deconditioning syndrome. Since they didn't see any correlation with how much you're actually training, you're calling something overtraining. It should happen if you train too much and not happen if you train too little. Mm-hmm. But rather, it seemed to me more about your recovery factors. Are you sleeping well? Are you getting enough total calories? Are you getting enough protein? Are you getting enough carbs? And are you just cognitively stressed? Right? Yeah. So and again, like you're saying, maybe they're not statistically powered enough to see.
I think that, like, what that points to me is, you could say, okay, it's not overtraining, it's under recovery, but they're just two sides of the same coin, right? Overtraining is overtraining relative to the capacity for recovery. We can only expand our capacity for recovery to a limited degree anyways, right? So it's like, you can get your sleep right, you can get your relationship right, but there's going to be a point at which the capacity of the system is exceeded. Now, what it sounds like to me is that my conclusion from that study would be that the primary factor that were found in inducing overtraining were those factors that injured recovery. But the recovery is injured in relationship to the training stress. So would those athletes have become overtrained if they weren't training?
So this is the thing now. So again, like they're two sides of the same coin, but they're not. So first, like with the studies in particular. So again, it's post fact, right? They're not inducing overtraining in anyone. They're just they're taking the people that say they're overtrained, and then they do all the tests, and then they do all the calculations after the fact. So it's also not the best way. What I really like them to do is now you take a new group of overtrained people and you apply your statistics, and then you see
I'm surprised they haven't done this on people or if they haven't, I'd be very curious if people have done it on boot camp or SEALs training, right?
Yeah.
I think this is like
that would be great.
Clear instance of something that's going to likely to cause an overtraining effect.
Yes.
And you can kind of study, how that happens basically.
Yeah. You would think that'd be easy to get approval, but maybe like the military
into that. They like data, right? my kids are about to be home in like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
We're going to make this a hectic environment here. So really quickly, like one of the things, this has been like, I met Ido in 2011 and I trained with him in 2012. And like I've thought about becoming one of his online students, but I knew that my capacity for recovery wasn't up to what he wanted from me. So I was like trying to train myself up to recovering sufficiently to train with Ido. And then eventually I was just doing my own stuff and I lost interest. It wasn't the path. But then I worked with all these students of Ido's, and like, obviously I have a super biased sample, but like basically the people who came to me were the people who broke under the volume.
Right.
So what I've always thought is like, okay, well, volume is a training stimulus, and like any training stimulus, it needs progressive overload, right? Like to me, starting someone on a 40-hour-a-week movement program is like trying to have someone back squat 300 pounds the first time they back squat. It's like, is quite possibly going to exceed their capacity for load and cause them an injury.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how you have approached building people's volume up. So the way that I look at it is basically like, just progressive overload.
Yeah.
Plus addressing those recovery aspects, right? So if I want an athlete to handle more volume over time, I need them to improve their sleep. I need them to improve their nutrition. I need them to improve their relationship and work status. And I actually believe strongly in cultivation of the aerobic system as essentially expanding the capacity for recovery.
Yeah.
So, I'm curious if you have any other refinements on that kind of perspective.
I think I do about the same.
There you go.
I think we're on.
So I think you said that your students usually train with you for 7 days a week, 7 hours a week.
It totally depends.
But that's the kind of like the max that someone's coming to work with you to start with.
Again, totally depends.
Totally depends. Okay.
Yeah.
Because that would be like, if you never see anyone dealing with overtraining in 7 hours, and you're like, okay, well, at least I have this baseline, right? That's a volume that I can get people into.
Yeah.
And they're going to go for it, right? Like when I had parkour students who are training 90 minutes with me 3 days a week, never had an overtraining issue with any of those students.
Right.
I feel pretty safe starting at that level of volume with any incoming student.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't feel safe starting most students at 20 hours a week.
Yeah. I mean, it depends a lot, right? Like, and well, I guess maybe this is a difference. For me, I don't really think about it so much from a physiological perspective, actually. For me, it's all about the psychological perspective of what can you maintain what can you maintain motivation for, and so all the factors, the sleep, the diet, tell people all that, right? Those are things that like, they're going to be helpful, they're going to help you tolerate more volume. They're going to help you adapt better to the volume you have. Like it's just good, I
think my bias is physiological because that's those are my limiting factors. Like motivation has never been a problem for me in relationship to my practices.
Yeah.
As soon as I feel good enough, I'm incredibly hungry for my practice.
Right.
Aspects have been hard.
Yeah. So
it's not normal. Like lots of people struggle with motivation.
Yeah. To some extent, I think everyone does. Because there's always like, there's easy things to do. And especially with the movement practice, there's so much variety. It's not like you have to we're not doing like Bulgarian style Olympic weightlifting every day, right? Like you maybe do your Olympic weightlifting twice a week. You'd be training 4 times a day and you just only do Olympic weightlifting twice a week. Like it's right. Like you're doing all this work, you're doing all this balance work, the handstands, like when your wrists adapt to the volume, like the muscular demand of a handstand is actually quite minimal. You do tons of that time every day. Like Dance. Like there's ways to dance that are very demanding. There are ways to dance.
Really demanding. That's my best practice. So like the eccentric
parkour, exactly. Parkour is extremely high load. Yes. Yeah. So maybe that's more of a factor for you. But even like parkour, right? There's ways you can do.
Yeah, I mean, you can balance on that.
I was gonna say, I was like, the rail work is, you can do that all day. Slackline, you can do that.
Yeah. I've been slacklining at the Ninja Gym.
Yeah,
this is a really fun conversation, Bren.
Yeah,
time flew by. We went 45 minutes over the scheduled time. That didn't surprise me. I expected that you and I would get along like firecrackers talking about this stuff. So I'm sure we'll do it again. TheMovementCult.com is where people can find you. Just Bren Veziroglu.
Actually, yeah, Veziroglu. Yeah, I'm impressed. Actually,
GLU at the end. For anyone who wants to find you on Facebook, we'll add it, or on. You're on YouTube and Instagram?
YouTube, Instagram. I have a TikTok now too. I just haven't told anyone about it.
We can't promote TikTok on this channel. We're not supporters of the CCP. So we'll delete that. So, anyways, people know where to find you. I look forward to future chats.
Sounds great, Ray. Great talking to you.